All right. Hey, class. Here we go for Unit 2. So, for this unit, what I'd like to spend some time talking about is divine right and the movement from divine right to democracies during the what is now referred to as the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason, the Age of Rationality. There's a bunch of different terms that you may have bumped into. Another term that we'll be talking about is deism. And this is a pretty monumental shift that's going to start occurring around the Renaissance in the 1300s, but it's really not going to get rolling or have much impact until the late 15, early 1600s in Europe. And I promise, I know some of you are probably saying to yourself, what does this possibly have to do with the environment or nature? I'm going to bring all this around so as we can examine how this impacts our study of the environmental imagination, and it's pretty profound. In a lot of other classes I teach, we go off on other tangents on this, like in science fiction, because you have to understand how the Enlightenment impacts our worldview. Nature, obviously, being a substantial part of that worldview, and then science being the study of nature, how all of this interacts. And then, obviously, also, very interestingly, the birth of democracy for our own understanding of history in this country. So, all right, with that, so let's begin. So, in feudal Europe, which, as we know from the end of the fall of the Roman Empire, which I think many of you probably know, but the Roman Empire fell around 500 AD, and feudal Europe is going to have a pretty substantial stranglehold to about 1600 AD, when we're going to start to see we're start going to we're going to start to see pretty substantial fissures in the feudal power structure. It's not going to be obviously until 1776, the American Revolution, that we're really going to see a breakdown of feudalism. And then a lot of people will argue it's not going to be the end until World War One, where we really see the final death blow of feudalism. But for well over 1,000 years, and some people could argue 12 to 1400 years, feudalism was the main form of leadership and rule throughout our European history. And so at the top of that power structure, obviously, we have the Pope and Church. I'd even put above them, we have God, which is, I think, a pretty important distinction. Then we have the Pope and Church, and then we have the monarch, or the king, the nobles, knights, vassals, merchants, farmers, craftsmen, peasants, and serfs. Honestly, if we were to redraw this pyramid, I think more accurately, we would look at up here would be all of these people, very small portion of the population. And then down here, the bulk majority of our European population would all be serfs or a peasant class of people. So I think that's a little bit more accurate, but this is obviously shows the power structure that things move through. And you ask, okay, again, why is this important to nature? Well, a couple of reasons. The first reason is that as people started studying during the Renaissance, the ancient Greek and Roman tradition, the Renaissance was the rebirth of this Greek and Roman knowledge. And as they started to study this during the Renaissance, specifically in Italy, they started asking pretty complicated political questions as they looked at Greek philosophers who were talking about early democracy and representation and inclusion of the people in government. And so most of them, being religious clergy at the time, started asking complicated questions, saying, why do we have a king as our ruler? And obviously, that comes back to this idea of divine right. And so, if we look at divine right, divine right means that the king has a right to rule because of divine intervention. So, divine intervention meaning that God gives the king the capacity to rule. And we can see this pretty clearly. We have an old synchronism up here of of basically a pagan symbol intersected with a cross symbol. We have a slightly Jesus-like king sitting here with a glowing sword. And this glowing sword, as often is the case, the sword is connotated with the will of God. And you'll see that if you study anything having to do with King Arthur and the Arthurian legends, this period, the sword and the shield become emblematic of God's will. If you face off in single battle against your foe, God will determine the outcome. God will control your sword and your shield, and God's will be exercised through these acts of violence. Oftentimes by the knights. And so this was a pretty successful system of rule compared to some of the alternatives during the chaotic times known as the medieval period or the Dark Ages, as some people refer to them. Now, what gets interesting here, two things. One, we have church clergy starting to read old Roman and Greek texts and around the 1300s, and they start asking about notions of democracy. We also have questions over, which we'll get to in a few minutes, but the role of God in people's everyday lives. And we'll examine that. But the problem with this power structure and the abuses that it can lead to are well known. When we have a king is, basically a dictator who's given their right to rule through hereditary means. And when that starts to happen, if you question the power or the decision of the king, because when you have God, and then let's just simplify this right down to king, and the king becomes almost a mini godlike figure. And if they're not a godlike figure, I'll do a small g here, mini god, they at least are exercising this will of God. And so if you question the king, if let's say, you're someone below the monarch and you question the king, you're actually put into a position where you are religiously questioning the will of God. And that becomes terribly problematic because what can the king then do? The king can then kill you, torture you, do all of these things, oppress you for whatever particular, economic or political reason. And what justification do they have? They have the justification that this is the will of God. And this started to create some political problems and inconsistencies, especially as early capitalism started to occur in Europe due to trade and exploration that would follow this 1300-year period in the 1300s. So we had a lot of really complicated philosophical and political questions. At the exact same time, once again, due in the Renaissance period right here, due to increased interest in math and astronomy, we started getting some questions about the nature of the universe and the structure of the universe. And so, we learned about Copernicus and how Copernicus was starting to question the relative positions of the sun and the earth within the cosmos, and starting to be able to mathematically deduce that what the church had been saying was not entirely accurate. And the consequence of this type of questioning would often lead to these early scientists, we could call them, being literally burned alive, persecuted, thrown in jail, all sorts of things. And so, because they were starting to question the rulers, they're starting to question the Pope and the Church, and they were thereby questioning the will of God. So, as this starts to come out and unfold, divine right starts to slowly, very slowly, the foundation of divine right starts to weaken. And so let's take a look at this. And so again, you're asking once again, what does divine right have to do with this topic of the environmental imagination, or how we conceive of nature, and how do we see ourselves within the natural world? And this is a really important historical crux that to this day causes controversy and to this day causes debate amongst different groups of people on a regular basis. Truly fascinating. So, what ends up happening is that around this time period, we have people like Newton, and Newton's going to be a little bit later, but we have people like Newton coming up with the natural, you can see here, principles of mathematics. And what these early scientists started to realize is that there were fundamental consistencies within the natural world. And these fundamental consistencies within the natural world are what we would now call scientific theories or scientific laws. And that if we do something and we do it again, it's a repeatable pattern. And so this is, in the scientific method that you learned about, you take a process, and in order for your process to be deemed uh, reasonable or rational or important, it has to be repeatable and it has to prove something about something. Terribly important. So here, in this particular case, the story I like to use when teaching this concept is that pre-Enlightenment, before the Enlightenment, if, let's say, a giant bolt of lightning comes down and strikes the branch of this tree and breaks this branch off and kills a whole bunch of your sheep, why did this happen? Well, pre-Enlightenment, the reason would be this would be God's wrath or God's anger, God teaching you a lesson. It would be God's will. For whatever reason, it would sometimes be hard to understand, but it was God's will that your sheep died. So after this period of time, we start coming to a new view that actually, when there's a giant windstorm and there's a giant thunder and lightning storm, maybe instead of leaving your sheep underneath a giant tree out in the field where there's likely to be struck by lightning, because we know that lightning consistently strikes giant trees out in the middle of fields, maybe you should take all of your sheep and get them out of the field and move them into the barn, and thereby avoiding the death of your sheep. And so instead of this being God's will, you now have a personal responsibility to care for your own well-being within the universe. And this is along the lines of what's going to be called deism. And most of the American founding fathers are going to be fairly devout deists. Now, a deist absolutely believes in God, absolutely believes that God created nature, but they do not believe that God is constantly intervening in the nuances, in the minute details of people's lives. And so instead, they question, okay, what makes the universe tick? And they had this idea that they call the clockmaker theory, and that God was a clockmaker who engineered this terribly complex clock. And this is what we would call nature, and engineered nature and engineered the universe, and then wound this clock and set it ticking, this tick tock of the universe, and that God mostly stays out of the interworkings, the daily interworkings of life. And so this became, throughout Europe in the 16 and 1700s, a very powerful in political, religious, philosophical shift that starts to occur. And this is occurring because of the widespread birth of science and what we will call causality. What causes the tree to break? Is it God's will, or is it simply natural laws that God has established in order to make the universe work? And so deists are going to say, well, there's natural rules, mathematics, astronomy, physics, that we can study and that we can know, and those rules are followed. and they are consistent, and we can repeat experiments that we complete. So if you start to adopt a deist worldview, what happens when we go back and we look at divine right is this person who becomes the monarch, how do they become the monarch? Because if God's not intervening on a regular daily basis in the minutia of human lives, then God didn't choose the monarch. And so then people start asking, oh, sorry, get distracted here. People start asking a very important question. Why is the king the king? And if it's not God's will, well, whose will is it? And this is the very question that the founding fathers of our nation started to ask. And this questioning of divine right, as a result of science and a changing view on the natural world to a scientific mode of thinking, and the clockmaker philosophy of God's intervention, leads to the birth of democracy. And this leads to, so the way we look at nature and the way we look at religious cosmology is going to be a terribly important piece of democracy being born, because the king has to be disjointed from God before the mass of people are going to be willing to overthrow this concept of the king and finally and permanently end divine right. And so here in this particular case, we can see that a view of nature incorporating causality and science, re-examining the role of personal responsibility in the world, will kill God, or kill not God, kill divine right. And so God's control over leadership and rule. And so what these deists were asking, the founding, like I said, many of the founding fathers of the American Revolution were saying, you know what? If God's not choosing the leader, you know whose responsibility it is to choose the leader? It's our responsibility. It's a personal responsibility of every individual in our nation to choose the leader. And so, as you can see, a view of nature, along with, and it wasn't the only factor. There are many other economic factors and lots of factors, but this was the major philosophical crux of the era that had to be dealt with before democracy could be born. So I hope that helps in this class. I'm really hoping that you all can begin to examine the large breadth of influences that how we look at nature impact, but how we look at politics, how we look at economics, how we look at social issues, how we look at literature and the arts. Our view of nature impacts all of these things on a very regular basis. I mean, if you look at some of the debates in modern environmentalism, these come down to politics, they come down to belief structures, they come down to economics, they come down to very complicated social interactions. And our view of nature is interwound within all of these moving pieces all the time, both historically and in the present sense. So as we continue to look at this, we're going to walk through the major historical trends that help define our view of nature. So I hope that you're starting to see that pattern. We're going to spend one more unit talking about science and industry and what the scientific revolution is going to lead to in terms of urbanization. And then we're going to get into some things that are very much influence the American concept of nature, which will be referred to as romanticism. And that's all coming. So thanks for your time, and I hope you enjoyed.